thank you all for being here. I'm really entertained by seeing all sorts of people who I don't know, which is nice. It's a sort of small community, so it's good to see all of you new people, or who to me are new people. This is not my talk, so I'll try to extemporize. Ooh, plunged into darkness. So I'm going to sort of try to hit two things. This talk started its life as a much more heritage and management oriented talk, but I've added a bit in the middle. I took out all my nice examples from old projects to address Bill's question of the morning, where he said, Josh is going to tell you all about that work we're doing. So I'll tell you a little bit about that work we're doing by way of examples of the kind of work we're doing. So the initial aim of this talk was to sort of help us as archaeologists in Mongolia, or anywhere really, protect ourselves from ourselves, right? We are in some situations in terms of how research is carried out and funded right now that pushes us to behave in certain ways, or us as a community to behave in certain ways. And I'm going to make the argument that we shouldn't do that, basically, that we should do a lot of archaeological survey. If you take one thing away from this talk, it'll be do a lot of survey. That's the aim of the game here. So what do I mean when I'm talking about integrated narratives, right? So initially, of course, that means bringing together lots of different things, so a multifaceted or multi-focused kinds of projects. But it also means projects that are interested in the integration of two things. So transitions are very important for the way I look at archaeological data. So not so much focusing in on a particular techno-typological period, but how do we get from one to the next, to the next, to the next, to the next, and so on. And also, it's a phrase I can use a lot, right? In the way of integrating the way that we approach research. So bringing in lots of different viewpoints, lots of different researchers into looking at the same regions or the same questions. So it's those kind of things that I want to have you hold in your mind when I'm talking about how we're trying to put things together here. This is, of course, not the study of transitions, essentially, is not a new problem in Mongolian landscape archaeology. It is a landscape filled with archaeological objects. So we can only assume that not just ourselves, but anybody moving around this landscape and building new things or interpreting human action in the landscape was having to interpret, having to try to figure out what was there before. So we should both think about that prospect. How did other people address the monuments or structures or sites that were already there? And how are we seeing their ideas, their interpretations of their own pasts, the past's past, right? So that was the end of kind of introductory material. So if you're familiar with what I do, I have studied for a while the origin of pastoralism. And when I started, I thought of this as a big thing, right? So my research topic, I would tell people, I'm interested in the origin of pastoralism in Eurasia as a large process. But the longer I work at it, the more I start to see it as a collection of much smaller segments, right? The density of data that I have access to has increased. And so I'm looking at things in a very contextual way, or I'm thinking about things in a very contextual way and in a sort of interrelationship of different practices. I think this is an important thing to understand about pastoralism, or the use of the Mongolian landscape in general, as we go forward and study it. And if you've seen any of the recent big reviews by Honeychurch and Makarowitz, or there's another one coming out by Hammer and Arbuckle pretty soon, and they're big global studies on pastoralism in Eurasia or pastoralism in the Near East. That doesn't make them global, I guess. That makes them macro-regional studies. Okay, so, and one of the messages that really comes out of a lot of these really detailed analyses of what we know archaeologically and what we know ethnographically is that there are many pastoralisms. There are many different practices and sets of practices, and we can't really talk about one universal practice in terms of pastoralism. So an important thing to take from that archaeologically is that, and we think that we will not necessarily understand what was going on at the origins of pastoralism. I think Bill used exactly that same line this morning, didn't you? Anyways, we all try the same lines to see if we can get a laugh off of them or something. Anyways, we don't really, there are things that we may never understand with an ethnographic approach. There are people who, as early Bronze Age pastoralists, may have done things that we don't have an example for anymore, right? So that we won't necessarily be able to apply what we know now to the very early record. But we can recover that, all these sort of segmenting of practices that we're doing with isotopic work, with other sorts of things like that. are letting us understand the kind of actual practices of Bronze and Iron Age pastoralism as opposed to using strong ethnographic models. And this is kind of, this is information we get from this real close reading of the archaeological record, essentially. Close reading of the archaeological record. So the work that we do, that Bill and I and others do, we generate extremely dense regional data sets, right? And this lets us get close to lots of different processes. And by doing that, to build these complicated, integrated regional narratives about what we're looking at. And these systems, I'm a big booster of these systems, right? I tell everybody they should do it. This stuff allows us to make more elaborately interrelated networks in the past, to discuss these things in a more elaborated, interrelated ways, so that, in a sense, there's something that you see a lot in, you see frequently in publication, the earliest of this, the first of that, and so on. So this is a way of avoiding falling into a sort of hole of firstism, because someone's always going to come along and be first after you were first. But by having a very dense data set, by having very dense ideas about what's going on, perturbations in your system, if you thought of it as straight up as a network system, they have less effect on the rest of the system. So we know more, we can see change more effectively, we can see change more dynamically, and essentially in a more interesting way. Not to say that everybody should be interested in the same things I am, but I think it's more interesting to be able to look at how these structures react to each other and interact with each other. So the material that this talk was originally had in the middle of it was drawn from 3 surveys that Bill and Amar Tuvshin and I have done, and some other people who are here have been involved in different ways. And this slide has stayed in here because I think this is an interesting narrative between these 3 projects. As you can see, we started back in the early days. I wasn't going to say that. I don't want to say that. We just started. The first project, and I would argue, and Bill, I haven't talked to you about this, so maybe you can disagree with me, is that I think this kind of tracks the development of modern archaeology in Mongolia. So when we started out here in the 90s, we were trying to figure things out. Everybody was trying to figure things out. How do we do this? What are we finding? How does Mongolian archaeology work in the New World, and so on. So it was very much a kind of experimental project. We tried things. They sort of worked. BGC, the Bagasar and Chalo project, was more structured in a foreign collaboration way. We worked very closely with our Mongolian colleagues, but a lot of that work was driven by the research agenda of the foreign constituents of the project. But now DMS, the Dornod Mongol Survey, this is practically an intensification of the Mongolian CRM system. In a sense, though, we're doing a research project. Many of the choices we make in terms of how the research is conducted are driven by the Mongolian side of the project. Can't tell whether Bill is scowling at me or not for saying that. He's just waving his hand. All right, we'll fight later, I guess. So anyways, that's the history of the 3 projects from which this idea is drawn. I also want to make a moment, again, I said I was going to try to pitch archaeological survey to you. I may be singing to the choir here in that sense, but I think that archaeological survey, or landscape archaeology, intensive archaeological survey particularly, has certain values that make it really useful to carry out integrated research, and also to keep us doing focused and good work in the areas that we're working in. Foremost, it is honest, right? It is honest. It keeps us from being drawn towards the biggest, brightest thing on the landscape, right? Because you're going to do complete coverage, you're going to record everything, you're going to sort of look behind the curtain of the landscape, and you're going to know what is normal and what is abnormal in a situation. It's very focused, sort of what I just said, very focused on the contexts of things more than the things themselves, in some sense. It's an inclusive strategy for that same reason, that you find all sorts of stuff, so you have to deal with it. You have to include those things in your narrative. So one of the things I like about full coverage survey work is that no object is ever left alone, right? So you will find a small stone pile or a small sherd. There will eventually be a place for that object. Even if it's not something you were looking for at the time, you'll be able to include it in your story. And finally, the big landscape approaches give you a framework for, big landscape methods give you a framework for multiple things, right? So whether it's a major focused on excavation, whether it's focused on some other kind of bioarchaeological work, or even non-archaeological work, the baseline that you get from a big regional study, a big integrated regional study, provides you with a medium through which all that other work can travel. So some of that other work. So now I'm going to tell you a little bit about some of the things that we are finding first with our surveys in general, and then specifically at Delgerkhan. So we're changing gears here to end the ranting on why you should all do survey, to say, look, this is what survey can bring us, and I think that this will resonate with some of the things we've already heard today in terms of it would be nice to know this or whatever. So primarily, and although we work with a lot of monuments, we're really looking for habitation landscapes. That's the real target of doing this work, not just recording landscapes of monuments, but also figuring out where people lived in the past and how they lived and so on. So, and we've been able to do this. This is Egengulf, where we produced many periods of survey, but I think our most notable piece was Xiongnu habitation, sort of assembling a deep inhabited Xiongnu landscape over time and through different kinds of site sizes and different relationships to the mortuary record and so on. So this is what sort of guides us or drives us. We want to do more of it. But another nice thing about, again, full coverage is that you can be surprised. You can be surprised by what you find, right? So one of the things we found in Egengulf that we didn't expect is that we found this complex Buddhist landscape here, and of monasteries, of irrigation canals, of supernatural flood control, of all these sorts of things that people were doing, and we dutifully recorded it, and so on. It wasn't the main focus of the work, but it really, in a sense, informed and made the valley itself more interesting over the long term. So the third thing, this is the last of the sort of general statements. Of course, there's a lot of monuments in this story, but the long-term approach gives you a monumental continuity, right? So we see how these systems of monuments integrate with one another, how they become contested spaces, how we see people returning and returning to the same spots again and again to build monuments in different periods. I was very happy to hear, I think Brian Hanks, all over the SAAs, telling everybody how people were returning to Kurgan sites. I was like, I already knew that. I'm very happy, though, that we see that in lots of different regions. So this integration of monumental landscapes is a key part of this approach, of these sort of approaches. So now I'll talk a little bit about Delgerkhan. So we're really changing gears again. So Bill was talking about some of the things that we're finding on the survey there. And so I'll run you through a little bit of the mostly the early Bronze Age or Bronze Age to early Iron Age material. Some of these maps will be a little hard to read. These are actually our sort of report maps, so they're not meant to be projected on screens. But the point I want to make from this map is, if you can see all the yellow and orange dots, these are habitation scatters. So this is a 3 square kilometer survey block in the middle of Delgerkhan. You can get a feel for the density of land use here. Admittedly, these are long periods, right? We're survey, so we can't, surface artifacts aren't necessarily going to reveal to us really precise chronologies. But if you can see all these little speckly black things, those are different monument groups, different monument types and different monument groups that relate to these early periods. So you can get a feel for how busy this landscape is, and that the monuments don't necessarily dominate the landscape. The large artifact scatters are what dominate the landscape archaeologically. An even harder to read map, but it makes the point of something that Bill pointed out, that the Olanzok period. So this is the 3 square kilometers you just saw, and then in extensions to the north of it. In these periods, maybe that's the 3 square kilometers. So anyways, this is the central drainage, the water that Bill was talking about in the middle of Delgerkhan, and all the orange and red. These are all Olanzok, so Middle Bronze Age or the earliest Bronze Age tradition in this. Even if they're Bronze Age, let's say monumental tradition in this area, you can see them gathered. The dots are not to real scale, but they are scaled relative to each other. So you can see how the monument groups, these large monument groups, are gathering up along the edge of this drainage in a very constructed, very purposeful way, and then stretching up into the hills. So we're rising in elevation as we go towards the upper right corner. Stretching up into the hills, you see again all those little habitation scatters dotted along ephemeral water courses, and a few monuments just up on the ridge. So this is a very constructed, very kind of conceived landscape in this time. Another interesting aspect of this, and I think this will be interesting to the Altai, even to Tibet in a sense. So this is a chain of Olanzok burials that, from a set of drone imagery, I think Bill showed you the same chain. So one of them has now been excavated. But one of the curious things about this landscape, this Olanzok landscape, is not just its burials and its habitation, but all the other weird things that are gathered around it. So you see these linears. These are ground level linears that just shoot off into the distance. It's north at the top if you're doing your compass directions right now in your head, trying to figure out what the orientation of all these structures is. And there's a lot of these things out here, right? So there are also bizarre sort of mega-sized structures. There are weird rings. There are long little stubby alignments. They don't appear to be deer stones. They're not done. And then there are big collections of these linears and these square structures without names all through this. And this is all associated spatially with this Olanzok early Bronze Age or Middle Bronze Age mortuary tradition. I might say we don't know much about these since most of this recording seems to have been done in the last week of the last field season. So what can I tell you besides plans? Beautiful plans. So this is the site you just saw, but cleaned up so it's much more readable. You can see the structuring of this landscape. There's about 45 of these square things and then a 200-meter linear and then all these little standing stones. And that's all associated with a single burial, so a single thing that has a vertical expression. The rest of that stuff is ground level. So again, as I said with the other images of monuments, it's a very constructed landscape, a very sort of mentally planned landscape. Now we're back to the soapbox, to the rant, right? So the problem we face, if I were to say you should all go off and do super intensive survey all the time, is how do we talk about the big questions, the things that sort of excite people, the sort of trans-Eurasian things? We do this, I would argue, or at least we do this, with very deeply built models. So again, we're building, instead of building out, we're building in, we're building lots of information, lots of different interacting data sets to be able to build complex models that we can work with in different ways to try to understand what's happening in these early periods, or in any period for that matter. You should all go out and do regional archaeology. If you're really crafty, you've seen this slide before. I have changed some of the numbers. But if you're not in here, let me know. So these are square kilometers of intensive survey. So the survey that's going to be closely spaced lines, it's going to recover habitation sites and so on. So it seems like a monumental job. But if you go across Mongolia or the general Eastern Eurasian region, you can start to see that there is a decent amount of work that's been done. We can really talk about how people in different periods inhabited the landscape by bringing together a lot of this work that's been done. So a lot of us are interested in this Bronze Age, the smallest of the numbers, but if you're interested in the medieval period, you're doing pretty well, right? So that's including work that's been done in Inner Mongolia both by the Pittsburgh survey, well, by the Pittsburgh family of surveys, I prefer to call them now, that goes all over Inner Mongolia into different places. But we see hundreds, and if not thousands, of square kilometers of regional archaeology. I've also learned from Esther that Esther is the personal champ of walking around Mongolia. Do you mind if I repeat your number again, Esther? Do you mind if I repeat your number? Esther has personally explored 22,000 square kilometers of the Altai.
It wasn't all on foot.
It wasn't all on foot, and yes, it wasn't back and forth at 20-meter spacing, but it's still an impressive piece of number. But all those numbers pale in comparison to the work that the Mongolian Institute of Archaeology, or Academy of Sciences CRM arm, has accomplished in only essentially 7 years. So this is one of the big issues, I think, in the future of Mongolian archaeology, is how to deal with this vast amount of data, this growing piece of gray literature, how to build even larger understandings of the interrelationship of landscape that's being generated. I was floored when I got this number from Amra, by the way. So in account of time, I won't say much about this. There we go. That's what we need to do in the future. We need to build capacity within Mongolia to do this kind of research so we can have more people working together. And there we go. That's it. Thank you very much. Are we having a question period, or we're saving it for later?
Yes. Questions?
All
We
right.
can take just a few questions.
I will answer all your really specific questions about survey archaeology in these regions.
I would like to ask you to elaborate on the last slide on the building capacity of local citizen archaeologists.
I mean, we're not really thinking so much in terms of citizen archaeologists when we say that. That's great too, but mostly we're talking about breaking down the space between the expert from outside of Mongolia and the Mongolian archaeologist. And this is happening extremely fast. Like, you see the abilities, the skills, the interests, the ideas that are being developed by the people that we work with And it's amazing. It's amazing. But we still are outsourcing a lot of the specialty work, for example, to non-Mongolians, and that we need to figure out how to do that in Mongolia. We need to train more Mongolian archaeologists in the sort of more elaborate methodologies that we're using. And they're not, I mean, I say elaborate, but they're also fundamental to what we're doing. So the building up of comparative collections, the training of zooarchaeologists, the training of bioarchaeologists, the training of people who do different sorts of lab work and so on. All those things, there needs to be a lot more of that in Mongolia. People working, doing elaborate mathematical studies, databases, GIS, all this stuff we've talked about. And that's happening quickly, but I would argue it's not necessarily quickly enough.
What would be your explanation of such recent surge increase of this interest in all these expeditions? It takes resources, it takes government, commitment and institutional support. So what would be the explanation of such interest in
You mean,
recent years?
why has there been an explosion of research in Mongolia in the past, say, 20 years or so?
In archaeology.
In archaeology.
More specific.
Money.
Dr. Honey.
Yeah.
Money. Yeah, so the Mongols are looking for resources. Mongolia is also an interesting place to work. It's a relatively easy place to work compared to some other places in Asia. Since there's a recording running, I won't say anything. But
it's also part of their own, that they have a strong interest in preserving their culture in
Yeah.
the face of, the growing mining industry. I think it's coming from within,
Yeah.
inviting us into develop.
Well, there's also a set of a long, socialist set of institutions as well.
True.
Yeah.
All these things are true. Yeah. So, Esther,
I can't remember if I asked you in Bonn, but.
ask me again. Either way,
I'll ask
these
you
people didn't
again.
hear it. So,
So these structures that we were talking about, I think, I call them dwellings,
Yeah.
you call.
the rectangular things.
Yeah, do they occur at all three of your survey areas?
No, we only have them here. So this thing is a new thing for us in this region.
It's very, very puzzling, isn't it?
I'm puzzled.
I'm puzzled too.
We'll excavate some. We'll find out.
How do you date them as early Bronze Age?
At this point, we date them only by their spatial association with burials of known date. So arguably, they could be post that, where people came in and very carefully built them into the alignments of those other structures. But at least in the case of those long linear lines, you can trace them right up into the burial fabric, into the fabric of the bigger burials. So it's by association right now. But if they prove to be similar in subsurface structure to the ones in the Altai, we'll be able to get some dates. And then we'll have a much clearer idea.
Worthy knowing that we really just started paying attention to them last summer.
Yes, as I said.
We didn't even know, we didn't even realize that these things were that comprehensive, that impressive, until we actually, I think it was the drone also.
Yeah, we had seen them, but we
Yeah.
couldn't really get the whole extent of them until the Institute's drone guys were there, and they were saying, "Look at the size of these things."
Yeah, so
You know.
this is actually very new to us as well. So we're still in the guesswork phase to a certain
Yeah, we've seen things like that that are associated with monasteries. Like in Housegold, there's some areas where there's some of those kinds of rectangular structures that
Yeah.
seem to be associated with monastery development.
Yeah, as far as we know, we're far away from any monasteries in that area, which is kind of a mystery. But it's 12, 15, 20 kilometers to the nearest monastery from that area of Delgerkhan. Yeah.
I'm curious, you identified an area as being, with a series of quite close together rectangles, as being a clear sign of a Buddhist establishment of some sort.
Did I say that? I think that was from another talk. Was it an ovo line? Did I say the word Buddhist?
No, sorry.
That one. Yes, sorry. Yes, Egingolf. Those are field systems.
Those are what?
Field systems.
Irrigated fields.
Yeah. So they're
19th century farming.
19th century farming.
Yeah.
So we want to talk about monasteries.
Yes.
Go. One more. There we are. These things, right? Yeah. Sorry about that. I was like, I'd forgotten that they were rectangular. Yeah. So this is a valley floor, a grassy valley floor it has big feeder canals that take spring runoff water, and they're dug along the sides, and then it's fed down through quite an elaborate irrigation system. And analogically, but from other regions, mostly Tibet, we think that they're spring flooded fields, and then they plant in them, and as they sort of freeze and thaw in the spring, and then it wets the soil and so on.
So you're seeing that as a Buddhist tradition rather than an indigenous pattern of...
I wouldn't make that division. I wouldn't say it's a technology that's being adopted. This whole region in the 19th and early 20th century was turned into plantation farms to provide for the large monasteries in the south of it. And so the structure of habitation and so on is clearly still in the Mongolian mode, but this whole agricultural system certainly resonates with the way that you see it in other regions. But
And there were tremendous connections.
yeah, and there are tremendous connections. I mean, that's the point. That's why I wouldn't see it to be some kind of intrusive thing. It's an adopted technology. Anything else? Okay.